Somerset, September the year 1815. The invitation had come through Mrs. Calloway, which meant it had come through the one woman in the county who believed that every problem between a man and a woman could be solved by placing them in the same room and leaving them there long enough to reach an understanding. Mrs. Calloway had been doing this for 30 years, with a success rate she considered excellent, though several of the people she had placed in rooms might have described the experience differently. The Duke of Ashworth needed capital. The Sefton family had a daughter with a fortune large enough to rebuild a crumbling estate, and the composure to survive a duke while doing it. The arithmetic was convenient. The feelings were not consulted. Rowena Sefton arrived at Ashworth Hall on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of September, in the company of her uncle, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had been balancing ledgers since she was 14, and negotiating on her father's behalf since she was 17. She wore a gray wool dress, simple and well-made, the kind of garment that communicated seriousness rather than display, which was a deliberate choice. She had her father's mind for numbers, her late mother's stillness under pressure, and the unshakable habit of reading every room she entered, the way other women read novels, for the story underneath the surface. Ashworth Hall was beautiful and deteriorating. She saw both of these things in the first 30 seconds, the way one sees a handsome face with tired eyes. The stonework was excellent. The roof above the east wing was not. The gardens had been designed by someone with taste and maintained by someone without budget, and the result was the particular kind of genteel decay that said old money running out rather than new money coming in. She noted all of it. She noted the way the housekeeper moved through the entrance hall with the careful efficiency of a woman managing a household on half the staff it required. She noted the portrait above the staircase of a woman with dark hair and an expression that suggested she had found something privately amusing about being painted, and she filed this detail away without knowing yet what it meant. They were shown to the drawing room. Her uncle settled into a chair with the practiced ease of a man who had been through many such arrangements and expected nothing from any of them. Mrs. Calloway materialized from a side door with the timing of a woman who had been listening for the carriage, and Rowena sat with her hands folded and her attention fully operational, and waited for the Duke of Ashworth to appear. He didn't appear. 11 o'clock became 1/2 past. 1/2 became 12. Mrs. Calloway's composure underwent a series of increasingly visible adjustments. Her uncle examined the ceiling. Rowena sat in the drawing room of a man who had requested her presence and then failed to provide his own, and she thought about what this meant, and she decided it meant something she was going to have to see for herself before she concluded anything. He arrived at 10 minutes past 12. He came through the door with the distracted energy of a man who had been elsewhere and had not entirely left it behind, and he was not what she had expected. She had expected arrogance or indifference or the polished surface of a man performing his station. What she got was something rougher than that. He was tall and unevenly weathered, with the hands of a man who had been doing something physical recently, and the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a thought he considered more important than the interruption. His coat was good, but not new. His boots had mud on them. He looked at Mrs. Calloway, and then at her uncle, and then at Rowena, and his gaze stayed on her for 2 seconds longer than the social register required, which she noted the way she noted everything, automatically and without visible reaction. "Miss Sefton," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I apologize for the delay," he said, though the apology had the quality of a man who understood the convention of apologizing without being entirely committed to the sentiment behind it. There was a matter in the East tenancy that required attention. A matter, Mrs. Calloway said, with the tone of a woman who had been sitting in a drawing room for 70 minutes and had opinions about matters and their timing. It could not wait, he said, and the way he said it closed that particular line of inquiry with the efficiency of a man who was accustomed to closing things. He looked at Rowena again. "Shall we walk?" he said. It was not a question. It was a redirection. He was taking the interview out of the drawing room and away from Mrs. Calloway's management, and Rowena understood this for what it was, a man who preferred to conduct his assessments without an audience. They walked. He led her away from the formal gardens and toward the working part of the grounds, past the stables, past the kitchen garden, along a path that ran beside a stone wall toward the tenant farms, and she understood that he was not showing her the estate's best face. He was showing her what he actually cared about. They walked in silence for 4 minutes, which was long enough for most people to become uncomfortable and begin filling the space with words. She did not fill the space. She walked beside him and waited for him to arrive at whatever he had brought her out here to say. The sky had been threatening since morning. The clouds were low and gray, and had the particular density of clouds that were not bluffing. They reached a gate at the far edge of the tenant field, a good quarter-mile from the house, and he stopped and turned to face her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been waiting for. The real one. The one underneath the late arrival, and the mud on his boots, and the apology that was not entirely an apology. "Miss Sefton," he said, "I will be direct with you, because I do not have the patience or the inclination to be otherwise." She waited. "I need money," he said. "The estate requires significant investment. The east wing, the tenancies, the drainage, the south pasture. All of it. I need a wife whose fortune can address these things, and I need a wife who will not interfere with how I address them." He paused. "I have been married before." She studied him. She noted the set of his jaw and the way his hands had gone still at his sides, and she understood with the precision she brought to everything that the second statement was the one that mattered, and that everything he had said before, it was scaffolding. "What happened?" she said. He turned toward the field behind her. "My wife believed that her opinions about the estate were equal to mine." He said this with the careful neutrality of a man selecting words the way one selects stones for a wall, each one load-bearing and deliberately placed. She involved herself in decisions that were not hers to make. She contradicted my instructions to the tenants and the steward. She created confusion where there had been order. He looked back at Rowena. "I will not have that again." Rowena looked at him. She looked at a man who had handed her his wound and called it a policy, the same way one might hand someone a loaded weapon and call it a gift, and she thought about what it meant that he could not see the difference. She thought about the word interfere and what it contained, and how a man who used it about his dead wife in a field with a woman he had met 40 minutes ago had not yet understood what it revealed. She opened her mouth to respond. The rain began. It did not begin gradually. Somerset rain in September had no interest in preamble. It came down heavy and immediate, the kind of rain that soaked through wool in under a minute and turned paths to mud in under 2. She glanced at the sky. Her eyes went to the house, a quarter-mile away across open ground. She turned to the Duke, who had also looked at the sky, and then at her, and something moved across his expression that she could not immediately categorize. "Come," he said, and he turned toward the house. She did not move. He took 3 steps before he realized she was not beside him. He turned back. "Miss Sefton," he said. The rain was already heavy enough to require raising his voice slightly. "You have not finished," she said. "I beg your pardon." "You were telling me your requirements," she said. "You have told me what you need and what you will not tolerate. You have not told me what you are offering in return." He looked at her. The rain was falling on both of them now, with the comprehensive indifference of weather that had no opinion about dukes or fortunes, or the things people said to each other in fields. "Miss Sefton," he said, "We are getting wet." "Yes," she said. "We are." She did not move. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain ran down his face and into his collar, and he did not wipe it away. And she did not wipe hers away either. And they stood in the September rain at the far edge of his estate. And he saw something in her expression that he had not been expecting to see, which was that she wasn't going to move until he answered her, and that the rain was not a factor in her calculations. He turned away. He walked toward the house. He left her standing in the rain. She watched him go. She watched the broad back and the muddy boots and the fast, purposeful stride of a man who had decided the conversation was finished because the weather had made it inconvenient. And she thought about what this meant. She considered a man who would walk away from a woman standing in the rain rather than answer a question he had not prepared for. She turned over the word interfere and the dead wife and the loaded quality of his silence, and she understood with the clarity she brought to all important decisions that this wasn't a man who had been wronged by a difficult woman. This was a man who had been married to someone who had opinions and had decided that opinions were the problem, and had organized his grief around the principle that the next woman would have none. She surveyed the rain. Her gaze found the path he had taken back to the house, already blurring in the downpour. She considered the gate behind her, and the field beyond it, and the stone wall running along the boundary of an estate that needed her money, and did not yet understand that it also needed her mind. She did not leave. She did not follow him. She stood at the gate in the September rain, with her gray wool dress darkening and her hair beginning to come loose from its pins, and her hands at her sides. And she waited. She was not waiting for him to come back. She was not waiting for the rain to stop. She was waiting because the act of standing still in a place where she had been left was saying something she had not yet found the words for, and the standing was more precise than any sentence she could construct. She stood for 40 minutes. She stood while the rain soaked through her dress and into her shoes, and while the path turned to mud around her boots, and while the September afternoon grew dark and cold and entirely indifferent to her presence. She stood because she had asked a question and had not received an answer, and because leaving without one would mean accepting his terms, and she had not come to Somerset to accept terms. She had come to be seen. She stood because the rain was not the lesson he thought it was. He thought leaving her in it would teach her something about his authority and her position and the distance between a duke and a merchant's niece who had been summoned to discuss the possibility of being useful. He thought the rain would send her inside. He thought wrong. Mrs. Calloway found her first. She came down the path with an umbrella and the expression of a woman who had witnessed a great many things in 30 years and had not yet witnessed this particular thing. "Miss Sefton," she said. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," Rowena said. Her voice was steady. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was flat against her head, and she was standing in 3 inches of mud. And she looked, Mrs. Calloway would later tell Lady Barris, like a woman who had decided something and was not going to be moved from it by anything as trivial as weather. "You are soaked through," Mrs. Calloway said. "I am," Rowena agreed. "He left you here. He did." Mrs. Calloway studied her. Her gaze moved to the house, then to the path between them, and she calculated something she had been calculating for 30 years, which was the distance between what a man intended and what a woman decided to do with it. "Come inside," she said, and held out the umbrella. "Has he come back to the window?" Rowena said. Mrs. Calloway paused. "He has been at the window for 20 minutes, she said. "Which window?" "The library, facing this direction." Rowena turned toward the library windows, visible from where she stood, 200 yards away, blurred by rain but unmistakable. She could not see him. She knew he was there. A man who walked away from a question did not stop thinking about the question. He simply thought about it from a safer distance. She took the umbrella. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," she said. She walked back to the house at her own pace, which was not fast. She walked the way a woman walks when she is making a point with her feet that she has already made with her stillness. And the point was this. I asked you a question. I am still here. The question is still here. The rain did not change it, and your leaving did not change it. And when you are ready to answer it, I will be ready to hear it. But I will not chase you into your own house to get it. She reached the entrance hall. Her uncle was standing at the foot of the stairs with her traveling cloak and the expression of a man who had been paying attention to his niece for 23 years and had learned that the most useful thing he could do in most situations was hold her coat and say nothing. He held her coat. He said nothing. She took the cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders and stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall, dripping onto the marble floor, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was nothing. The Duke did not come down. Mrs. Calloway brought dry clothes and tea and the composed regret of a woman who had arranged a great many introductions and had never had one go quite like this. Her uncle said nothing on the carriage ride back to the Sefton house in Milverton, which was 12 miles of Somerset Road in the rain, and he said nothing for the first 6 of them. And then he said, "You stood in the rain." I did. For 40 minutes, approximately. He was quiet for another mile, and he watched you from the window the entire time. For the last 20 minutes of it, she said. Possibly longer. Mrs. Calloway only confirmed the last 20. Her uncle looked at the Somerset countryside through the rain-streaked carriage window and thought about his niece standing in a field in a downpour while a duke watched from his library, and neither of them moved, and neither of them yielded. And whatever had happened in that field was not what either of them had planned for. "What will you do?" he said. Rowena looked at the road ahead. She thought about the East Wing, with its failing roof and the tenancies that needed investment, and the kitchen garden, and the housekeeper managing on half the staff, and the portrait above the staircase of the woman with dark hair and the privately amused expression, and the way the Duke had said the word interfere with the weight of something he had been carrying for longer than he understood. "I'm going to buy Thornfield," she said. Her uncle turned to look at her. Thornfield had been on the market for 5 months. It was a mid-sized estate 3 miles east of Ashworth, with good land, a sound farmhouse that had been converted to a gentleman's residence 2 generations prior, and the particular advantage of sharing a water source with the Ashworth estate. The River Barle ran through both properties, entering at Thornfield and exiting at Ashworth, which meant that whoever controlled Thornfield controlled the upstream flow. It was, from a purely practical standpoint, an excellent investment. "It is an excellent investment," Rowena said. Her uncle, who had spent 23 years paying close attention to this particular person, looked at her with the expression of a man who recognized a business decision that was also something else entirely. "The water rights," he said. "The water rights are significant," she agreed. "The river enters at Thornfield. Anything that happens upstream affects Ashworth." Her uncle was quiet for a moment. "You are buying his water supply." "I am buying a sound property with strategic value," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the road. The rain continued with the patient indifference of weather that had no opinion about property transactions or the women who conducted them. "Rowena," he said, "it is entirely a business decision, Uncle." He said nothing further. He had learned, over 23 years, that when his niece described something as entirely a business decision, the entirely was doing work that the rest of the sentence could not support. She almost believed it herself. For about a week, Thornfield was purchased in October, which was faster than most property transactions in Somerset, because Rowena Sefton had her father's solicitors in London, her uncle's accounts in Bristol, and the focused determination of a woman who had decided something and considered delay a form of weakness. The seller was an elderly gentleman who had retired to Bath and wanted the matter concluded before Christmas, which suited Rowena precisely. The Duke of Ashworth was informed of his new neighbor by his steward, a man named Hathorn, who mentioned the sale during the weekly estate review in the careful way that stewards mention things they know are significant while maintaining the fiction that they are routine. The Thornfield estate, Your Grace, sold last week. The Duke set down the account book he had been reviewing. Sold to whom? A Miss Sefton, Your Grace. Of the Milverton Seftons. Hathorn paused. George Sefton's niece. The Duke looked at the window. Not the window that faced south toward the formal gardens, or the window that faced west toward the tenant farms, but the window that faced east toward the boundary where Ashworth land met Thornfield land, where the River Barle wound through the valley in its steady, unconcerned way. The river, the Duke said. It runs through Thornfield first. It does, Your Grace. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Has the water rights agreement been reviewed recently? Not since your father's time, Your Grace. Have it reviewed, he said, before the month is out. Hathorn noted this with the professional neutrality of a man who understood exactly what was happening and intended to say nothing about it, and the estate review continued. But the Duke looked at the east window 3 more times before it was finished. She was at Thornfield by the first week of November. This surprised the county in the particular way that Somerset was surprised by things, which was to say, quietly, over tea, with the calibrated attention of people who had been observing each other's business for generations. November was not the season one took possession of a Somerset estate. November was for London or Bath, for closing the house, not opening it. Rowena arrived on a Thursday with 2 wagons of household goods, a housekeeper she had brought from the Sefton house in Milverton, and a surveyor whose particular expertise was water rights and riparian boundaries. The county noticed all 3 arrivals. It noticed the household goods because they indicated permanence. It noticed the housekeeper because she was local, which meant Rowena was serious. And it noticed the surveyor because a surveyor meant a boundary question. And a boundary question involving Ashworth land was the kind of thing the county paid close attention to, being a county that understood the relationship between water and power and the families that controlled both. She spent the first week learning Thornfield completely. She walked every room, every outbuilding, every fence line in the November cold, with the systematic attention of a woman conducting an audit. The house was smaller than Ashworth, but better maintained. The land was good. The tenant cottages needed work, but not urgently. The orchard had been let go, but could be recovered. She noted all of it, and had a plan drawn up by Monday. On Tuesday morning, she walked to the river. The Barle entered the Thornfield estate at the northeast corner, running through a shallow valley between 2 hills before crossing the boundary into Ashworth land, half a mile downstream. It was a modest river, clear and cold in November, the kind of water that supported a mill or an irrigation system or a fish weir, all of which Thornfield had possessed at various points in its history, and none of which were currently operational. She stood at the riverbank and looked downstream toward Ashworth. The Ashworth chimneys were not visible from here, blocked by the hills and the tree line, but she knew the direction, and she knew the distance, and she knew that the water, moving past her feet, would be at Ashworth within the hour. She heard the horse before she saw it. He came from the Ashworth side along the river path, at a pace that said he had known she was here, and had come deliberately, and was not entirely certain why he had come, and was not going to examine the question. He pulled up on the far bank of the Barle and looked at her across the water with an expression she recognized from the field in September. The assessing one, the one that preceded a position he had already formed. "Miss Sefton," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy. They were standing on opposite sides of a river in November. The courtesies were for drawing rooms. He regarded her. His gaze moved to the river between them. It settled on the surveyor's stakes she had driven into the bank that morning, marking the boundary line where Thornfield water became Ashworth water, and something moved in his expression that was not the assessing look. Something less certain than that. "You have wasted no time," he said. "I have not," she agreed. The estate required attention. "The river," he said. "My steward tells me you have engaged a surveyor. For the water rights." "I have." He said nothing for a beat. The river moved between them, cold and steady, indifferent to the conversation being conducted across it. "The water rights agreement," he said, "between our estates. It has not been reviewed in 30 years. "Then it is overdue for review," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The November wind came down the valley and moved through the bare branches above them, and neither of them moved, and the river continued between them with the unhurried certainty of water that had been running this course since before either family's claim. "You are very direct," he said. "You told me you valued directness," she said, "in the field in September. I took you at your word." Something shifted in his expression. Not the assessing look. Something that lived in the space between what he had decided about her and what the evidence was beginning to suggest. "The water rights review," he said. "It concerns both estates. It will require discussion." "It will," she said. "I intended to write to your steward about it." "Write to me," he said. She looked at him. "The matter concerns both properties," he said. "Write to me directly." He turned the horse. "Good morning, Miss Sefton." "Good morning, Your Grace," she said to his retreating back. She stood at the riverbank for a moment after he had gone, and thought about the word directly, and about the expression that had not been the assessing one, and about a man who had left her standing in the rain in September and had just asked her to write to him in November, and she went back to Thornfield and did not think about any of it for the rest of the day, with moderate success. The Water Rights Review was commissioned, conducted, and returned with results that were both predictable and extremely useful. The Thornfield deed, dated 1789, granted the estate full riparian rights over the Barl from the point of entry to the boundary crossing, including the right to divert, dam, or otherwise modify the flow for agricultural or domestic purposes. The Ashworth estate records, going back to 1712, asserted an unbroken claim to the full flow of the Barl as a downstream right, which meant that any upstream modification by Thornfield that reduced or altered the water reaching Ashworth was, according to the Ashworth interpretation, a violation of precedent. Two legal positions, both defensible, both incompatible. 77 years of overlap, during which neither estate had tested the other's claim because the previous Thornfield owners had been the kind of people who did not test things, and the Ashworth family had been the kind of people who were not accustomed to being tested. Rowena read both documents at the writing desk in the Thornfield parlor on a Wednesday morning and thought about the river running through both properties, connecting them whether they liked it or not, and about the pleasure of a problem that was both legally interesting and practically significant, and that would require her to sit in a room with the Duke of Ashworth and argue. She wrote to him. The letter took 3 drafts. The first was too warm. The second was too cold. The third was precisely correct, factual, measured, specific, ending with a proposal for a meeting to review the documents together, which was the reasonable next step, and also the step that would put her across a table from him again, which he was not going to examine too closely. She sent the 3rd draft. His reply came the following morning, which was faster than she had expected, in a hand she recognized as his own, rather than a secretary's. Miss Sefton, I have reviewed the water rights documentation. The discrepancy is clear. I propose Friday next, 10 o'clock, at the river crossing. Bring the 1789 deed. I will bring the 1712 record. Ashworth. She read this note twice. She noted that he had written it himself. She noted the absence of pleasantries, no social framing, no performative courtesy, just the time and the documents and the expectation of her presence. She found this, against her better judgment, more honest than elaborate politeness would have been. She sent back 3 words. Friday, 10 o'clock. Sefton. Friday was cold and clear in the way of Somerset in late November, the kind of morning where the air had an edge to it, and everything was visible for miles, and there was nowhere for imprecision to hide. She arrived at the river crossing at 5 minutes to 10. He was already there, on foot this time, the 1712 record in his hand, his steward 2 paces behind him. She had brought her surveyor. They spread the documents on the flat stone at the river crossing, the old bridge abutment that had been there since before either deed was written, and stood on opposite sides of it, and read each other's evidence, with the focused attention of 2 people who were both entirely right and entirely incompatible. The 1712 record predates the deed by 77 years, he said. The deed is the operative legal document, she said. Precedent is not law, he said. Precedent has practical force, she said. And practical force and legal right are different things, and I find the distinction worth preserving. He looked at her across the old bridge stone with the expression that had been changing across their meetings, moving in increments away from the assessing one and toward something that required more of his face. You have done this before, he said. Negotiated a water dispute. Negotiated, he said, with something in the word that was not an accusation. My father's business involves a considerable number of negotiations, she said. I have been present for most of them since I was 15. Your father involves you in his business. My father involves me in everything, she said. He has no sons. He has me. He decided when I was 12 that this was either a problem or a resource, and he has proceeded on the assumption of the latter. She met his gaze. He has not been wrong. The Duke studied her. His gaze moved to the river, then to the documents between them on the old bridge stone. I am going to make you a proposal, he said. She waited. The disputed stretch of river, he said. The section between the Thornfield entry point and the Ashworth boundary. I propose a joint usage agreement. Thornfield retains its upstream rights under the 1789 deed, but agrees to maintain minimum flow levels that protect Ashworth's downstream requirements. Both parties contribute to the maintenance of the shared stretch. The agreement is recorded formally and reviewed every 5 years. She looked at him. You have 200 years of precedent, she said. You could contest this through the county court and likely prevail on historical grounds alone. I could, he said. Why don't you? His gaze went to the river, because it would take a year and cost both estates more than the water is worth, and at the end of it, one of us would have the rights, and the other would have a grievance, and we share a river. He turned back to her. I prefer a functional river to a legal victory. She considered the documents, then the river between them. She thought about the proposal, which was fair and practical, and the kind of thing a man offered when he had decided he respected the other party enough to settle rather than win. I accept, she said, on the condition that the minimum flow levels are determined by independent survey, not by Ashworth estimate. He paused. Agreed, he said. She extended her hand across the old bridge stone. He looked at it. The hand of a woman who managed her own property, in a glove that was good quality and slightly ink-stained at the right thumb from the pen. He shook it with the brief, firm grip of a man who meant what he agreed to. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "Good morning, Miss Sefton," he said. She walked back to Thornfield with her surveyor and the 1789 deed, and the satisfaction of a woman who had held her ground and been met with something she had not expected. The winter dinners began in December. Somerset society in the cold months was a closed system, the same families rotating through the same houses, with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this since before anyone could remember and intended to continue long after anyone stopped caring. Rowena had been received into this system with the cautious interest of a county that was not yet certain what to make of her. She was wealthy enough to be included. She was not titled enough to be assumed. She was, several people had noted independently, extremely good at conversation, which in Somerset society was either an advantage or a liability, depending on whose conversation she improved. She and the Duke were at the same dinner 4 times between December and February. Each time, the conversation between them found its way to the river, to the water agreement, to the practical matters that connected their properties, and each time the practical matters lasted exactly long enough to be credible before the conversation moved to something else. She had learned during these dinners that he read seriously, that he had opinions about agriculture that were better informed than most of the counties, that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he did speak, he meant it. She had also learned that his attention, when it was directed at her, had a quality she had not encountered before, a completeness, as though he had decided to be fully present for the duration and would not be distracted by anything less important, which appeared to be everything else in the room. She was aware of this. She had stopped pretending not to be. Mrs. Calloway, who had been observing these dinners with the invested attention of a woman who considered the water rights settlement a promising development, had taken to appearing at Rowena's elbow at the end of each evening, with observations she presented as casual and were anything but. "He watches you," Mrs. Calloway said after the February dinner at the Barris house. "He watches everyone," Rowena said. "He does not watch everyone the way he watches you," Mrs. Calloway said. She paused. "He has not watched anyone this way since Marguerite." Rowena looked at her gloves. "I am aware of the history," she said carefully. "The history, Mrs. Calloway said, is a wound he has dressed as a principle. Principles can be revised." She paused. "With sufficient evidence." Rowena looked across the room at the Duke, who was taking his leave of Lady Barris with the formal courtesy of a man concluding an evening. "I bought Thornfield as an investment, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Of course you did," Mrs. Calloway said, with the serenity of a woman who had been told this in slightly different words 4 times and had formed her own conclusions. "Good evening, Miss Sefton." The spring assembly at the Barris house was the first large gathering of the season. 35 people, the full county, and Rowena arrived with Mrs. Calloway, who had developed the habit of collecting her in the carriage without either of them having formally arranged it. The Duke was there. He was across the room when she entered, and he looked up, and the attention was the one she had learned to identify. The evening moved in its circuits. She talked with Lady Barris about the spring planting. She talked with Sir Edmund Hale about the county road improvements, which were Sir Edmund's particular passion, and which he could discuss for longer than most people could listen. She talked with the Duke, who appeared beside Sir Edmund at some point during the road discussion, and stayed. And the 3 of them talked about roads until Sir Edmund was called away by his wife. And then it was just the 2 of them. And the conversation moved from roads to the river to the spring flooding at Thornfield, to a question he asked about her father's business in Milverton. That was the first question he had ever asked her about herself, rather than about the land. She answered it. He asked a second question. She thought, this is what it looks like when he is actually interested. She thought, I should not be cataloguing what he looks like when he is actually interested. Lord Fenwick arrived at her left shoulder. She had seen him circling for 15 minutes. Fenwick was 56, a baronet with a small estate south of the Barl. the kind of man who had never revised a position in his life and considered this a mark of character rather than a limitation. "Miss Sefton," Fenwick said, with the tone of a man about to perform generosity while delivering an insult. "Thornfield is looking very well, I hear. Considerable improvements." "Thank you," she said. The river management required attention. "River management," he said, with a smile at the 4 people within hearing. "One does wonder whether a lady of your background appreciates the complexities of Somerset water law." He paused with the practiced timing of a man who had been delivering these pauses for decades. That is to say, one hopes the investment reflects a realistic understanding of how long new arrivals typically remain in the county. She looked at him. The word realistic did the work he intended it to do. In another mouth, it was neutral. In his, with his audience and his smile and his careful staging, it meant you are a merchant's niece playing at being a landowner, and everyone here knows it will not last. She held his gaze. She had heard this particular variety of condescension in Bristol, counting houses and London solicitors' offices, and she had a comprehensive response prepared. She was formulating that response when she heard the Duke's voice. "The river management at Thornfield," the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the field voice, not the dinner voice, not the negotiation voice, but the one underneath all of them, the one that had 300 years of Somerset in it and knew exactly what it carried, has resolved an upstream flooding problem that has been affecting both properties for 20 years. He looked at Fenwick with the complete assessing attention that had been directed at Rowena in September and was now pointed at someone else entirely. "The investment is entirely proportionate, as anyone familiar with the Barle Valley would know." Fenwick's expression underwent a rapid adjustment. "Of course, Your Grace, I merely—" "The county," the Duke said with the quiet economy of a man who did not need volume, benefits from landowners who take their property seriously. "I believe we are all agreed on that." He looked at Fenwick for one moment longer than was necessary, which was the ducal equivalent of a closing argument. Then he returned to the conversation, as though nothing had occurred, and Fenwick found someone else to occupy his attention with the haste of a man who had been corrected in public and needed time to recover his position. Rowena stood beside the Duke in the aftermath of this and thought about what had just happened. She thought about the weight of what he had said and how he had said it, and the fact that he had said it at all. He did not look at her. He was talking to Sir Edmund about the road bill, and nothing about his manner indicated he had done anything significant. She thought, "He knows he has." She thought, "He's waiting to see what I do with it." She crossed the room and stood with Mrs. Calloway, who looked at her expression, and then at the Duke across the room, and then back at her expression. "He intervened," Rowena said. "I saw," Mrs. Calloway said. "He did not have to." "No," Mrs. Calloway agreed. "He did not." "He made it about the river," Rowena said. "He made it about the land." "He made it about the land," Mrs. Calloway agreed, so that Fenwick had no way to continue, so that the room understood his position without requiring a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused, "Which is a very particular kind of intelligence." Rowena held her glass and looked across the room at the Duke, who was still in conversation and was not looking at her. He looked back, not the assessing attention, the other one, the one she had stopped pretending not to notice. She held his gaze for one moment, one beat longer than the social register required, and then turned back to Mrs. Calloway and said something about the road bill, and the evening continued around them, and neither of them said anything further, and it cost them both considerably. He came to Thornfield on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the assembly, which was fast enough to mean it had been decided before he arrived. She was at the river when he came. The spring flooding had receded, and she was checking the bank reinforcement with her estate manager, standing in mud to her ankles, in a work dress she would not have chosen for receiving a duke. But she had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime in January and was not going to resume the practice. She saw him from across the field. He was at the Thornfield gate on foot, and he waited there while she finished her conversation with the estate manager and walked back across the field toward him. She did not hurry. He did not appear to expect her to. "Your Grace," she said when she reached the gate. "Miss Sefton." He looked at the river behind her, running clear and steady in the March morning. "The bank reinforcement," he said. "It is holding." "It is," she confirmed. "The downstream section at Ashworth has been clear this spring for the first time in 3 years," he said. "Your surveyor's redesign solved both problems." "I am glad," she said. His gaze moved from her to the gate between them, which she had not opened. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "In the field," he said. "In September." "What I said and what I did." He paused. He was looking at the gatepost rather than at her, which was the only indication that this was costing him something. "I came to that meeting with a position formed before I walked through the door, a position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with." He stopped. "Your first wife," she said. His eyes met hers. "I understood in the field," she said. "That is why I stayed. Not because you insulted me, though you did, and not because you left me in the rain, though you did that as well, but because I understood that you were not seeing me. You were managing a wound." He let the silence hold. "Yes," he said. "I am not Marguerite," she said. "I am not a correction for Marguerite. I am not a quieter version of Marguerite who will stand where she is told, and hold no opinions, and manage no ledgers, and interfere with nothing." "I know," he said. "I have known it since November." He looked at the field behind her. "You are not a quieter version of anything." He paused. "You are the most ungovernable person I have encountered in a decade of governing a very large estate. And I mean that as a complete accounting of my situation." She looked at him. She thought about a man who had walked into a field with a wound dressed as a policy, and had spent 5 months having the policy dismantled by water rights and river surveys, and a woman who knew exactly where she stood and had purchased the ground beneath her feet at market value. "You defended me at the assembly," she said. "He said Fenwick was." "You defended me," she said, before he finished the sentence. He met her eyes. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because he was wrong," he said. "And because I was the person in that room most qualified to say so, and the most obligated." He paused. "And because you had already made the case better than I could. I wanted it stated." She turned this over. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The river is worth seeing from this side, and I believe I owe you tea." He came through the gate. He fell into step beside her on the path toward the house, and the March morning was clear, and the river was running clean, and nothing had been resolved, and everything had been said that needed saying first. The tea was in the Thornfield parlor. She had chosen the parlor because it was where she worked, not the sitting room, which was for guests, and he was not a guest. He was a man who had come through a gate she had opened, and who had said, "Because you had already made the case," and who was now sitting in the chair across from her desk with an expression that had nothing managed in it. She poured. She handed him his cup. She sat back and looked at him across the desk, covered in estate papers and river surveys, and a letter from her father's solicitor she had been answering that morning. "You work here," he said. "Every morning," she said. "Not the sitting room. The sitting room is for visitors. You are not a visitor." He looked at her. "You are my neighbor," she said, "with whom I share a river and a water rights agreement. The sitting room would be excessive." He drank his tea. She wanted to say something about September, and she said it. "I want to tell you why I stayed in the rain," she said. He waited. "I understood what you were doing," she said. "In the field, the moment you said it. That you were not describing me. You were describing what you needed after what you had been through." She met his gaze. "I did not stay because I was proving a point. I stayed because leaving would have meant accepting your terms, and arguing would have required you to defend a position you held for reasons neither of us were ready to discuss." She paused. Standing was the only honest response. He was quiet for a moment. "You stood in the rain for 40 minutes, he said. "I was aware of the time," she said. "What were you thinking?" Her gaze dropped to the desk, then lifted to the man across it. "I was thinking that a man who walks away from a question does not stop thinking about the question," she said. "He merely thinks about it from a safer distance. And I was thinking that if I was still there when you came back to the window, you would have your answer before I gave it." He looked at her. "I came back to the window after 3 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Calloway told me 20. He paused. Mrs. Calloway was being diplomatic. He set down his cup. "I stood at that window and watched you stand in the rain, and I thought, this woman is either the most stubborn person I have ever encountered or the most certain, and I was not sure which was worse." "And what did you conclude?" "That they were the same thing," he said, "and that the woman standing in my field in the rain was not a woman who would accept the word interfere applied to her, and that the word had been wrong when I used it about Marguerite, and that I had been building a house on a word that had been wrong from the start." A pause. She held his gaze. She considered the man who had come through her gate and sat in her parlor and said the word had been wrong from the start. And she understood with the precision she brought to everything that this was not just an apology for September. This was a man dismantling the entire architecture of his grief in front of her and discovering that what was underneath it was something he had not prepared for. "William," she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and his grace and the careful space where a name would go. And now the name was in the Thornfield parlor, and neither of them could take it back. "Yes," he said. "I bought this estate because of you," she said. "Not entirely. The property is sound, and the water rights are significant, and the investment was rational. But I bought it, knowing it was upstream of yours, and I told myself it was strategy, and I almost believed it for about 2 weeks." She looked at the river surveys on the desk. "I was angry," she said. "I wanted you to see me, not the fortune and the uncle and the category you had assigned me. I thought if I controlled your water supply, you would have to see me eventually." His gaze held hers. "That was not a conventional approach," she said. "It was an effective one," he said. "It resulted in a water rights dispute and a flooding crisis. It resulted," he said, "in you being in this parlor having this conversation." He paused. "I consider the investment sound." She looked at him for a long moment. He stood. He came around the desk. She stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting. They were very close in the Thornfield parlor, with the March morning light coming through the windows and the river surveys between them and 5 months of negotiations behind them. "I was wrong about you," he said, "in the field in September. I was wrong before I met you, and I was wrong when I left you in the rain, and I am asking." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression that had nothing of management in it. "I am asking whether I am too late to be right." She held his gaze. Her mind went to the rain. 40 minutes in a September field, and a man at a window who had watched her stand and had understood what it meant, and had spent 5 months arriving at a conclusion he was now prepared to act on. She did not step back. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, and looked up at him and said, "You are not too late." He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his position for 5 months and had arrived at a conclusion. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and river surveys and every true thing she had ever decided. And the parlor was warm, and the March morning was outside, and the surveys were still on the desk, and none of it required further management. They were engaged by the 2nd week of April. He had asked in the Thornfield parlor, again, on a Wednesday morning with the directness she had come to trust, and she had said yes with the same directness, and they had shaken hands on it, before either of them registered the absurdity of shaking hands on an engagement. And then he had looked at their joined hands, and she had laughed, and the laugh was small and real and entirely unmanaged, and he had received it with the expression she now understood was his version of complete happiness. Her uncle received the news with the satisfaction of a man who had watched his niece buy a neighboring estate and had understood exactly what she was doing, and had waited with considerable patience for the outcome. "The Duke of Ashworth," he said, from behind the Bristol accounts. "The man who left you standing in the rain. He has revised that position," she said. "He came through my gate and sat in my parlor and said the word interfere had been wrong from the start." She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his March is everything it should be." Her uncle set down the accounts. "Is he good enough for you?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "He's trying to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." Her uncle nodded. "It is the best version," he agreed. The Duke's letter to Rowena arrived the following morning. It said, "Your uncle's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The water rights will sort themselves." She read it twice. She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9, going back to the first note about the river survey. Mrs. Calloway called on Thursday with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 3 days, which was the maximum restraint available to her. "He was happy when he called on me," Mrs. Calloway said. "I have not seen him happy in 3 years." She looked at Rowena. "You are good for him." "He is good for me," Rowena said, "which is the thing I did not expect." "What did you expect?" "I expected to prove a point," she said. "I expected to be competent and present and impossible to ignore. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." Mrs. Calloway smiled, not the social smile, the real one. "He is going to discover," she said, "that he has acquired a wife who will manage his estate better than he does." "He has already discovered it," Rowena said. "He mentioned it twice during the proposal." Mrs. Calloway stood with the efficiency of a woman who had received everything she came for. "The engagement dinner," she said. "I will host it. The full county." She paused at the parlor door. "Fenwick will be invited. Because," she said, "it is better to have him at the table where he must behave than outside it, where he will not. And because the sight of Lord Fenwick congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Ashworth will be the most satisfying thing I have witnessed in recent memory, and I am not above enjoying it." Rowena looked at her. "I find I am not above it either," she said. They were married in June at the village church that sat between the Ashworth and Thornfield estates, beside the river that ran through both properties and connected them whether they chose it or not. She wore gray, not the ruined wool from September, a new dress, the color of rain clouds before they open, cut by someone who understood that gray on a woman with her coloring was not a compromise, but a declaration. The county turned out. 35 people from the engagement dinner and a considerable number beyond, because the marriage of a duke was an event, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an event with the additional quality of a story the county had been following since September, with the invested attention of people who had known something was going to happen and had not been certain what. Rowena walked in on her uncle's arm and looked at William at the front of the church and remembered the field in September, and the rain, and the man who had walked away from her question, and the woman who had not moved. She considered all the versions of standing. The first in the rain, 40 minutes. The one that said, "I am here and I am not leaving until you answer me." The second at the riverbank in November, on opposite sides. The one that said, "I have arrived and I am not going anywhere." The third at the assembly after Fenwick, standing beside the Duke in the aftermath of his defense. The one that said, "I see what you did." The fourth at the gate in March, when she had not moved toward him and had not moved away. The one that said, "The next step is yours." She had thought about the fifth version. She had thought about where it would happen and what it would mean. She reached the front of the church. William looked at her with the full unmanaged attention, the expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the field assessment, nothing of the man who had organized his grief into a requirement. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the estate upstream and argued the water rights and fixed the river and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. It was raining, not the heavy September downpour, but a light June rain, the soft kind that Somerset produced in summer, warm and unhurried, the kind that made the countryside greener than it already was and made the air smell of earth and growth and things continuing. She looked at him through the open church door. His eyes found the rain. She saw him remember. She saw September cross his face, and she saw him understand what she was about to do before she did it. She stepped out from under the church porch. She stood in the rain, not for 40 minutes, for 5 seconds, long enough to feel it on her face, on the gray dress, in her hair. Long enough for the county to see it and not understand it, and for William to see it and understand it completely. "I am still here." She stepped back under the porch. She took his hand. He held it with the grip of a man who meant what he agreed to, and he did not let go. And the rain continued outside the church, soft and warm, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. The answer they had both arrived at was that it had not been, not in the way she had told herself in September. The best investments, her father had always said, are the ones you understand better after you have made them than before. She understood this one completely. The rain understood nothing at all, which was, she thought, the particular grace of weather. It simply fell, and what you did with it, whether you walked away from it, or stood in it, or stepped into it on purpose on your wedding day, to remind a man of the afternoon he learned what it looked like when a woman refused to move, that was yours to decide. She had decided. She was not moving.